Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Georgia. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the late autumn of 1909, the town of Waverly Creek, Georgia, sat hushed beneath gray skies and thinning trees. The red clay roads had hardened from weeks without rain, and the air smelled faintly of iron and smoke. At the edge of the town stood a narrow wooden house, its windows dark, its yard lined with glass jars and weathered herbs hung from wires. Locals called it the widow's place. No one remembered her first name anymore, only that she had arrived after the war years and that she wore mourning black, even on Sundays when the church bell tolled. Her signboard read, "Remedies for Ailment, by Hand and by Faith." The widow had built her reputation slowly. Her tonics, she claimed, were guided by prayer and by a secret knowledge she had inherited from her late husband, once a physician who had treated soldiers during the outbreak of typhoid. The disease had taken him, she said, but left her with understanding. By 1909, when Georgia still saw its share of fever and infection, such claims found eager believers. Townsfolk from as far as Macon came seeking her bitter mixtures of bark, roots, and something stronger that few could name. The first report of trouble came quietly. A farmer named Ellis Boyd was said to have collapsed after taking her restorative draught. The coroner's notes, filed under County Record 17B, mention a faint odor of chloroform and metallic tincture. The sheriff, W.L. Marin, wrote only a line in the margin. No foul play proven, matter closed. But not everyone agreed. The local pastor, Reverend Clancy, told the Savannah Evening Post that he had concerns over her methods, noting that she rarely accepted payment in cash but asked instead for keepsakes, a ring, a lock of hair, a silver brooch. She says, "Metal remembers sickness," he warned. Weeks later, 2 more patients were buried, and whispers began that her cures worked only for those she favored. Others said she prayed over bottles in a language no one could place. The name widow began to sound less like respect and more like accusation. It was around this time that a young clerk from the county office, Samuel Dorr, began copying weather and illness data from the Bureau of Health's bulletins. Among the pages, he found reference to the typhoid fever in the United States surveys, records of rural outbreaks between 1908 and 1910. Waverly Creek appeared in the margin once, marked by a clerk's hand. 4 cases, unverified origin. That footnote would later draw investigators to her doorstep, though none could imagine what they would find in the cellar below that quiet wooden house. The records show that the sheriff returned to the widow's home on the evening of December 2, 1909. The sun had fallen early, leaving the pines black against the horizon. Inside, a faint lamplight flickered through the curtains, and the smell of camphor and vinegar clung to the walls. According to his later statement, Marin knocked twice before the widow opened the door, her hands stained with something dark, her expression unreadable. She claimed she'd been grinding roots for fever, nothing more. He searched the kitchen and the front room but found nothing unusual except rows of glass jars, each labeled in a spidery script. For the blood, for the nerves, for purity. One jar, Marin noted, was filled with a reddish sediment that shimmered when the light touched it. She told him it was iron mixed with tincture, something her late husband had used during the early typhoid years. She even mentioned the government studies, referencing the typhoid fever in the United States reports to justify her work, saying she aimed to spare the county another wave of contagion. The sheriff, half convinced and unwilling to press further, left her to her business. For a while, the matter went quiet. But in January, a letter reached the county seat from a woman in neighboring Dooley County. She wrote that her sister had come to the widow for treatment and never returned home whole. The woman described a pallor that set into her skin and eyes that no longer seemed to follow light. A second complaint followed, then a third. By February, the local health inspector, Dr. Alton Greaves, was ordered to conduct an informal visit. Greaves's notes, later found in a bound folder marked 1909 to 1910, described the widow as educated, articulate, and evasive. He wrote that she spoke of healing as if it were confession, blending scripture with crude chemistry. She showed him her small apothecary tas, blah, a clutter of powders, preserved plants, and a single brass mortar. On the shelves behind her were dozens of brown bottles sealed with wax. Greaves opened one, smelled the contents, and wrote simply, "Smell of ether, possibly contaminated." He took 3 samples and left without confrontation. That same night, neighbors claimed they saw a man's shadow moving behind her window, though none could say who it was. Some said it was the ghost of her husband. Others whispered that a patient had returned to demand justice. Only one man, a storekeeper named Lem Rudd, swore under oath that he saw a tall figure in a black coat standing near her yard, watching the widow at her work. The description did not match anyone in town. It was noted, then dismissed as imagination. Still, the fear spread quietly, and for the first time, mothers began pulling their children away when the widow walked by the church gate. By March of 1910, Waverly Creek had turned uneasy. What began as whispers of sickness had hardened into a pattern of fear. The widow's house, once a place where the desperate queued at dawn, now stood in isolation. Visitors came less often, and those who did arrived at dusk, cloaked and silent. The constable's office had grown tired of the reports. Strange smells, faint lights burning through the night, and cries mistaken for wind through the trees. Yet one file in the county ledger recorded a note from a neighboring farmer, Joel Pittman. Saw her digging at the edge of her garden near midnight, said she was burying roots, but the ground moved as if something heavier. The widow herself gave few explanations. When questioned, she said she buried what she could not heal, failed tonics, spoiled remedies. "The earth knows what to take," she told them, her voice flat, her eyes unfocused. She claimed that she followed natural order, that decay itself was part of her work. What she didn't explain was why several of her patients were missing. The family of Ellis Boyd, the farmer who first fell ill, had requested his records from the church archives. The clerk found that no death certificate had been properly filed, only a brief notation in the parish log, interred by private arrangement. The widow's nearest neighbor, a schoolteacher named Mary Corrin, kept a journal later found in the courthouse attic. Her entries spoke of sounds, hammering beneath the widow's floor, a rhythmic noise like metal striking bone. "She works by lamplight until dawn," Mary wrote. "Sometimes I see her face through the window, pale and set, and I cannot tell if she prays or counts." One Sunday, during service, Reverend Clancy addressed the matter indirectly. He spoke of false healers and the dangers of mixing faith with commerce. No one named her aloud, but every head in the congregation turned briefly. Toward the back pew she no longer occupied. By then, even the grocer refused to take her coins, believing they carried the sickness of the grave. In April, Dr. Greaves returned, this time with the sheriff. They found her garden freshly turned, but no bodies, no bones, only rows of strange plants she called angel's root and restorative vine. The doctor again referenced the typhoid fever in the United States study in his report, suggesting that her tonics might have contained contaminated water from the nearby well, yet the widow denied drawing from it. "My water comes from the earth's veins, not man's," she said. The statement confused the sheriff, but he wrote it down anyway. By early summer, the widow's house was nearly forgotten, though travelers sometimes stopped by, unaware of the stories. One such traveler, a salesman from Montgomery, was last seen entering her yard at dusk. His wagon was found 2 days later by the roadside, the reins cut clean through. The horses were gone, and so was he. When the salesman disappeared, the county could no longer ignore the rumors. Sheriff Merrin, accompanied by 2 deputies, rode out to the widow's house on June 17, 1910. The air was heavy with heat, and a storm was building somewhere beyond the river. They found her door unlatched, her curtains drawn, and the faint sound of dripping from inside. Merrin later testified that she greeted them calmly, though her hands trembled slightly as she offered them tea. "You've come about the stranger," she said before they had spoken a word. "He wasn't meant to stay long." The house smelled of damp earth and camphor. On her table lay several open notebooks filled with cramped writing, measurements, prayers, and the names of those she had treated. Near the window, a wooden crate contained small glass bottles sealed with red wax. The sheriff broke one open and found a murky liquid that burned his eyes. The widow claimed it was a blood tonic derived from mineral salts and herbs. "It's the metal that draws out the sickness," she explained. "It knows where to go." Marin ordered the cellar opened. A deputy found a trap door beneath the kitchen rug, leading to a shallow pit supported by rotting beams. What they uncovered there was not the salesman but remnants of old experiments, rusted instruments, cloth bandages stiff with age, and a series of glass jars half filled with cloudy preservative. Some contained indistinct shapes, too small to be human, too irregular to name. The sheriff described them as samples, though Dr. Greaves later wrote privately that one jar held what appeared to be a section of lung tissue. The widow insisted they were remnants from her late husband's medical practice. "He studied fever," she said, her voice level. "He wanted to understand what separates the living from the cured." That night, lightning struck the ridge beyond Waverly Creek. The storm washed through to her town, flooding ditches and uprooting fences. When dawn came, the widow's house stood dark, its door swinging in the wind. She was gone. The constables found no sign of her departure, no footprints in the mud, no wagon tracks. Only the table remained, set for one, and a single bottle labeled in her delicate hand. For the restless. Inside it was clear water, faintly metallic in taste. Dr. Greaves sent it to the state laboratory in Atlanta for analysis, but the report was inconclusive. The file simply read, "Trace elements, undetermined composition." A week later, a local boy claimed he saw a figure dressed in black, standing at the edge of the widow's property near dusk. She, or it, was motionless, facing the woods. When he blinked, she was gone. The boy swore to it until his dying day. By midsummer, the widow's house had already begun to sink into itself, the porch collapsing, the windows clouded with mold. No one would buy the land. Even the county assessor refused to set a value. The entry in the 1910 ledger reads only, "Property unclaimed. Owner presumed deceased." In the following months, the widow's absence became a presence of its own. People swore the air around her home smelled faintly of medicine and damp stone, as if her work continued without her. School children dared one another to touch the gatepost, then ran screaming when wind rattled the shutters. The few adults who went near the house, mostly county men sent to record the property, returned uneasy, speaking of a faint tapping beneath the floorboards and a humming like a woman's voice behind the walls. By autumn, the county sealed the doors with boards and iron nails, but the locals said it did little good. The noise, they claimed, carried into the woods. The only official correspondence from that period came from Dr. Alton Greaves, who was summoned to testify in Atlanta regarding rural medical practices. In his deposition, he referred again to the typhoid fever in the United States report, comparing the widow's tonic formulations to contaminated antiseptics found during the outbreaks of 1908. He described her methods as a crude imitation of legitimate chemistry driven by grief and superstition. Yet even Greaves admitted the analysis of her final bottle had left him troubled. There were no known pathogens, he told the committee, and yet samples placed near animal tissue caused discoloration within hours. His statement was never included in the public transcript. Back in Waverly Creek, the stories deepened. A hunter named Ezra Dooley claimed he saw smoke rising from the widow's chimney one October evening. When he approached, he noticed a dim glow through the cracks of the boards, flickering like a lantern swaying in the cellar. Too frightened to enter, he fetched the sheriff, but by the time they returned, the house was dark again. They broke the lock and searched every room. No lamp, no ashes, no signs of intrusion. Only the faint scent of burnt herbs hung into the air and a small puddle of clear liquid beneath the cellar door. When Marin touched it to his fingers, he said it tasted of metal and salt, like the tonic she once brewed. The next spring, a group of field workers clearing brush near the river uncovered what seemed to be medical waste buried beneath layers of clay, broken jars, cork stoppers, and a fragment of cloth bearing the initials MG. The sheriff ordered the pieces collected, but the evidence went missing from the courthouse within a week. Some said the widow had returned to claim what was hers. Others thought the deputies simply didn't want the trouble. By 1912, the house had rotted down to a skeleton of boards and vines, though travelers still asked for directions to the healer's place. No one guided them there. Those who tried often came back claiming they'd lost their way, even on familiar roads, as though the path itself bent to keep them out. By 1913, the legend of the widow of Waverly Creek had crossed county lines. Newspapers in Macon and Augusta carried brief, uneasy mentions of a lost healer and the Georgia woman of vanished cures. These columns were half rumor, half repetition, each writer claiming a new version. She'd fled to Alabama under an alias, or she'd been taken by fever herself, buried in an unmarked grave. But the name lingered, always the widow, never Mary or Margaret or any Christian name. In an unsigned editorial, one journalist compared her to the plague nurses noted in early typhoid fever in the United States records, those who stayed behind after outbreaks, tending the dying when others fled, and who were later blamed for what they could not stop. The comparison was meant as metaphor, but it fed the folklore all the same. That winter, a young teacher named Clara Wiles boarded at the old Corrin House, which stood near the widow's property. She wrote to her sister in Athens about the strange quiet that hung over the land. "Even the dogs won't bark at that direction," she said. "It's as though sound itself is swallowed." She described finding a trail of glass shards scattered through the weeds, remnants of small medicine bottles ground flat by time. One evening, she followed them toward the creek and saw, or thought she saw, a woman standing among the reeds, shoulders stooped, face hidden by a black veil. "The shape didn't move," she wrote, "but I could hear breathing, faint and close, as if behind my own ear." Weeks later, Clara fell ill with recurring fever. Her landlord found one of the widow's old bottles near her bedside, half full, though no one in town could recall seeing her visit the ruins. She recovered, but left Waverly Creek soon after, refusing to speak about it again. The bottle, according to her landlord's statement, vanished overnight. In the same year, a county survey, or named Abel Ross, began recording stories for a small pamphlet on Georgia folklore. His notes mention the widow's house repeatedly, locals describing blue light under the floorboards or the scent of medicine when rain hit the soil. "They say the earth won't take grass there," he wrote, "just weeds that smell like rust." Ross never published his pamphlet. He drowned in the Ocmulgee River the following spring. His belongings, when recovered, included a single glass vial stoppered with wax and a note that read, "It hums if you listen too long." By 1915, the ruins had almost vanished under vines, yet anyone passing the site still spoke in hushed tones. Some swore the air shimmered slightly above the ground, as if heated from below, though the soil stayed cool to the touch. Others believed the widow's spirit remained, working silently, distilling what she could not cure. By 1916, the widow's story had settled into something between record and superstition. The county files grew thin. Most officials involved had retired or died, leaving only second-hand notes and fragments of testimony. A new sheriff, younger and skeptical, visited the site out of curiosity. His report, dated April 2, 1916, describes the remains of the widow's house as a collection of half-buried beams and scattered glass. Yet he added a peculiar detail. When the soil near the collapsed cellar was disturbed, a faint, sweet odor rose from below, like spoiled flowers mixed with iron. The odor, he wrote, lingered on his hands for hours. He ordered the pit filled and covered with limestone, hoping to seal whatever miasma still lived there. The county doctor, a man named Prentice Hollow, reopened parts of the case after receiving a package from a retired chemist in Savannah. Inside, was a vial labeled Waverly Sample, 1909, one of the liquids Dr. Greaves had sent for testing years earlier. The chemist's accompanying letter noted a curious property. When exposed to air, the substance darkened and released faint vapors resembling formaldehyde, but without detectable traces of it. Hollow compared this to notes in the typhoid fever in the United States, studies that described experimental disinfectants of the period, some derived from metallic compounds, yet none matched the widow's formula. Whatever she created, he wrote, was not ignorance, but invention. That remark revived public fascination. The Macon Daily Telegraph published a brief column titled The Widow's Science, suggesting she might have been a self-taught chemist whose work frightened those who didn't understand it. Others weren't so charitable. Reverend Clancy, now old and frail, gave an interview recalling her insistence that metal remembers sickness. He believed her claim was not symbolic but literal, that she thought disease could be bound inside minerals like a soul trapped in stone. The idea spread quickly, giving rise to the phrase the widow's metal, which farmers used for years afterward to describe any soil that killed crops. Through 1917, reports persisted of travelers losing their way along the old Waverly Road, claiming their compasses spun uselessly near the creek. Some described hearing knocking beneath their wagons, as if something struck from below the ground. Others mentioned finding clear puddles that smelled faintly of ether. County officials dismissed these as coincidence, yet one deputy who accompanied the sheriff admitted privately that when he bent near the filled cellar, he could hear a faint sound, slow, rhythmic, like someone grinding herbs beneath the earth. When asked if he believed it, he said only, "If she's gone, she took the silence with her." By 1918, the old road to Waverly Creek had become overgrown. The bridge washed out that spring, and the county decided not to rebuild it, as no farms remained beyond the ridge. What little was left of the widow's property faded into swamp and vine. Yet the story, now 15 years old, refused to vanish. When the influenza epidemic reached Georgia that autumn, some families began mixing home tonics again, desperate for cures. A few claimed to have found the widow's old recipes copied in family Bibles or written on scraps of brown paper. Whether these were genuine or inventions of frightened minds, no one knew. Still, more than one household swore her mixtures broke the fever when doctors could not. It was said in whispers that one could smell camphor and metal in those rooms long after the bottles were empty. A schoolteacher named Thomas Ray collected several of these stories for the state archives. His notes, preserved in brittle pages, speak of the widow's influence returning during plague years, as though the land itself remembered her. He wrote that the ingredients mentioned in local recipes bore similarity to early disinfectant compounds cited in the typhoid fever in the United States records, proof, perhaps, that her work had not been as primitive as legend suggested. It's possible, he mused, she had glimpsed a truth about contagion before science could name it. The widow's former home, though decayed beyond recognition, drew visitors again during those years. One such visitor was a nurse named Louise Merrin, granddaughter of the sheriff who had once searched the house. Her diary, found in a chest decades later, records her visit on a gray afternoon in October 1919. "The air was heavy," she wrote, "and the ground seemed to breathe when I stepped upon it." She claimed she heard faint tapping beneath her feet, a slow rhythm like a heartbeat. Beneath a cluster of collapsed boards, she discovered an old iron spoon and a small glass bottle intact, its contents long evaporated. "For a moment," she wrote, "I thought I smelled something sweet and sharp, like medicine mixed with blood." She left the bottle on a church step miles away, unwilling to take it home. But that same week, her letters grew erratic. Friends later said she complained of a constant ringing in her ears and a metallic taste in her mouth. Whether illness, imagination, or something carried from that soil, no one could say. She died 2 winters later, and her notes became one more document in the widening file that historians could not close. The widow's name remained absent from all official ledgers. Her legend, however, had begun to turn from rumor into warning. the story of a woman who tried to heal and was devoured by what she sought to cure. By 1920, the legend of the widow of Waverly Creek had grown into a fixture of local folklore. In taverns and parlors, her name surfaced whenever illness swept through town. She cured the ones the doctors couldn't, some would say. Others swore she'd brought the sickness herself. The truth, as ever, lay buried under a century's worth of retellings and records fading to dust. A traveling journalist from Atlanta, Nathan Rourke, came that year hoping to separate fact from myth. His letters to the Atlanta Constitution describe a desolate patch of land where the widow's house once stood, a clearing bordered by crooked pines, the air still faintly bitter. No birds, he wrote, not even the hum of insects. It's as if sound itself refuses to settle there. Rourke stayed 3 nights in Waverly Creek, interviewing anyone who still remembered her. The surviving witnesses were few. Mary Corrin, now elderly and nearly blind, a farmhand who had once fetched water for her garden, and Dr. Greaves's former assistant, who remembered the tone of her voice more clearly than her face. She never spoke above a whisper, he told Rourke, yet you heard her as if she were beside you. They all described her as calm, deliberate, and watchful, never angry, never kind, simply present. Her house, they agreed, had a strange pull even when empty. Rourke's last letter was dated March 5, 1920. He wrote of visiting the site alone just before dawn. The ground was damp from fog, and faint shapes of glass glittered beneath the moss. He described kneeling to examine one when he noticed footprints, not his own, pressed lightly into the clay near the collapsed foundation. They led toward the woods, ending abruptly at the edge of the creek. No signs of animals, he wrote, but the impression was deep, like someone standing there for a long time. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, hearing a slow tapping echo from under the soil, like a pulse beneath water. After that entry, no further correspondence came. His editor assumed he'd moved on to another story. Months later, a fisherman found Rourke's satchel downstream. Inside were his notebooks, damp and unreadable except for one line inked across the back page. She's still mixing. No body was ever recovered. The county closed its records on the widow's case for good in 1921, filing the remaining evidence under miscellaneous unresolved. A final notation, written in the clerk's cramped hand, reads, "Structure collapsed, area condemned. Local folklore ongoing." Yet visitors who wandered too close claimed that when the wind blew from the east, they could smell camphor and rust, just for a moment, before the air turned still again. The decades following Rourke's disappearance left Waverly Creek all but forgotten on county maps. Roads shifted, farms failed, and newer towns grew along the railway lines, leaving the old settlement to rot in the shade of pine and kudzu. By 1925, the remaining families had moved on, taking with them whatever truth or fabrication remained about the widow. Only one official returned, a state archivist named Henry Tilden, dispatched to gather forgotten county records after the courthouse fire that year. He arrived by horse-drawn wagon, noting in his journal the smell of medicine and rain-soaked wood as he neared the site. What he found was a hollow depression in the earth where the widow's home had once stood, surrounded by the blackened frames of the porch and cellar entrance. Tilden uncovered a box of charred ledgers, their pages fused together by heat. Among them, one fragment survived legibly enough to read a date, 1909. The line beneath it said only, "Case resolved through the patient's own remedy." He interpreted it as shorthand from Dr. Greaves's earlier files, but couldn't confirm the author. Tilden spent the night cataloging what he could before a storm forced him to camp beneath the porch beams. He later described hearing a low hum carried through the rain, something like the whir of insects, though he saw none. At dawn, he noticed a shallow pool had formed in the cellar pit. The water shimmered faintly, as though infused with silver dust. He took a small sample in a bottle and sealed it. No record exists of what became of that vial. In 1926, a faculty paper at Emory University made a curious reference to the typhoid fever in the United States archives, citing unofficial regional formulations that predated modern antiseptics. One anonymous entry described a Georgia practitioner, female, widowed, who achieved remarkable preservation in organic samples. The Natimeuse. He ended abruptly, as if the writer had intended to elaborate, but never returned. Some historians later speculated that the widow had been in contact with traveling physicians during her lifetime, perhaps sharing her mixtures through correspondence. If so, she might have influenced experiments beyond her rural isolation, though proof remained elusive. By the end of the 1920s, the land around Waverly Creek was dense and nearly impassable. Hunters avoided it, claiming compasses failed, and dogs refused to enter the clearing. A retired deputy who had served under Sheriff Marin made one last visit in 1929. He brought with him a camera and a small spade, determined to lay the rumors to rest. His photographs, preserved only in fragments, show nothing but trees, fog, and the suggestion of a sunken outline where a foundation had been. But in the final image, taken just before dusk, there appears a pale smudge in the glass reflection, vague, almost human, standing where the cellar once opened. When asked years later if he believed it to be the widow, he only said, "The air there moves when it shouldn't. That's all I know." By 1930, Waverly Creek had become a place spoken of only in half-remembered stories told around gas lamps and church suppers. The generation that had known the widow directly was gone, and what remained were children's tales, how she had turned sickness into glass, how her husband's ghost still whispered in her cellar. Yet among the fading myths, a few scholars tried to untangle what might be true. A rural historian named Dr. Ruth Kellen undertook the task that year, supported by the Georgia Historical Society. She was methodical, skeptical, and wholly uninterested in ghosts. What she wanted was evidence, letters, testimonies, anything that could link the widow's work to early medicinal practices. Her notes describe traveling to county archives and finding the sealed box of Dr. Greaves's correspondence. Most of it had turned to dust, but one envelope contained a pressed leaf and a page marked Compound B. The handwriting mentioned a distillation process to draw sickness from the blood by metallic absorption. Kellen recognized the phrasing from public health studies similar to what was seen in the typhoid fever in the United States surveys. When she traced the chemical terms, she realized they bore resemblance to early antiseptic formulations that used silver nitrate, a substance rare and expensive at the time. How the widow could have accessed it was unknown. Kellen's letters to the university suggest that perhaps the widow had scavenged materials from her husband's field kits during the fever years. If true, she may have created mixtures potent enough to preserve tissue, explaining the strange samples the sheriff once found. But Kellen's tone changed in later correspondence. She began noting odd sensations during her visits to the site: lightheadedness, a metallic taste, and a persistent ringing in her ears. It is possible, she wrote, that the soil still contains residue of her experiments. Neighbors from the nearest town recalled that Kellen returned there once more in late August to collect what she called final material evidence. She rode out with a driver just before sundown. The driver waited on the road while she walked down the slope toward the creek. When she did not return by nightfall, he searched for her lantern glow, but saw none. By dawn, he went to fetch help. They found the lantern upright near the ruined cellar, still burning, though its fuel had nearly run out. Her satchel lay beside it, dry despite the morning dew. Inside were field notes, 3 small bottles sealed with wax, and a sketch of the widow's house reconstructed from witness accounts. Dr. Kellen was never seen again. The search party scoured the area for 2 days, but found no sign of struggle, only soft ground and the faint odor of something sweet and chemical in the air. Her disappearance was filed as accidental, lost in swamp terrain. Her final notebook entry, recovered from the satchel, contained one unfinished sentence: "The air here remembers." After Dr. Ruth Kellen's disappearance, the county finally restricted access to the Waverly Creek site. Officials posted weathered signs that read, "Private land, condemned, though there was no listed owner." Still, the warnings did little. By 1932, the place had become a kind of pilgrimage for the curious. Students from Atlanta came to collect soil samples. Preachers came to deliver impromptu sermons on temptation and science. Even a few traveling photographers wandered through, hoping for a story worth selling to the northern papers. None stayed long. They all described the same thing: an oppressive silence that seemed to dampen every sound, and a faint shimmer that appeared in the air above the ground when sunlight struck it. One visitor wrote that even the shadows moved in the wrong direction, as though light avoided what it touched. The last formal investigation occurred in 1934, when the State Health Department sent 2 technicians to take geological readings. Their instruments recorded irregular traces of mineral content, iron, silver, and traces of something unidentified, which one report described as possibly organic residue altered by oxidation. They compared it to early experiments with antiseptic metals similar to those mentioned decades earlier in the typhoid fever in the United States accounts. The report concluded that the anomaly is natural and harmless. But the field notes paint another picture. One technician wrote privately to a colleague that, while collecting samples, he felt a low vibration through the soles of his boots, as though the ground itself were humming. By then, the Depression had turned most of rural Georgia into silence anyway. Abandoned homes, failed farms, and empty roads left Waverly Creek to sink further into its own legend. A Methodist missionary traveling through the region that year wrote in her journal about sleeping near the creek and waking to find the air thick with an odor of camphor. "It reminded me," she said, "of hospitals and graves." In her entry, she mentioned glimpsing a woman in black by the water, standing motionless, her reflection rippling despite the still surface. "I called out," she wrote, "but the figure did not move. When I blinked, there was nothing." The site was marked unsuitable for habitation by 1935, and maps began printing it as blank space. Yet the stories continued in small, unconnected ways. Fishermen claimed their lines snapped when cast near the bend of the creek. Hunters found empty bottles half buried in mud, glass turned pale as bone. A child from a nearby village once brought one of those bottles to school for show and tell. Within days, the teacher said, the classroom filled with the sharp scent of medicine, though the bottle had been empty. The teacher buried it behind the church that afternoon, and the smell, she said, went with the wind, but never left the earth. By the late 1930s, Waverly Creek had nearly disappeared from new maps, but the story of the widow persisted in scattered clippings and county gossip. Traveling preachers warned of her forbidden knowledge, and school teachers used her tale as a moral about the cost of pride. But among scientists, her legend took on a quieter, more curious life. A professor of chemistry at Mercer University, Dr. Elias Ransom, became fascinated after reading Dr. Greaves's surviving notes. Ransom, known for his work with metallic disinfectants, claimed the widow might have stumbled upon an early colloidal silver compound, an antiseptic that later found legitimate medical use. He wrote in his 1938 journal that there is genius buried in her errors, suggesting that her experiments were years ahead of their time. He planned to visit the site himself in spring. Ransom's surviving correspondence to a colleague describes his arrival in detail. "The place is empty," he wrote. "The air is heavy, and the ground seems slick with old oil. I collected 3 samples, each giving off a faint metallic reflection under the lantern light." In a later note, he mentioned the odor of camphor rising from the soil after rain, exactly as the townsfolk had described decades earlier. He stayed one night in a canvas tent by the creek, where, according to his field log, he was awakened by a soft rhythm like water dripping from a great height. When he investigated, he found the sound came not from above, but from beneath the ground. "As if something is beating slowly below the roots," he wrote. "It is steady, not echoing, a pulse, not a trick of water." He returned to Atlanta 2 days later, visibly shaken. His assistant recalled that he refused to handle the sample jars again, saying they moved on their own when the room went silent. Within a week, he fell ill with a fever no physician could classify. His temperature refluctuated wildly, and he complained of a metallic taste that no tonic would wash away. Before he died that summer, Ransom reportedly told a nurse that the widow's formulas had not failed at all. "She didn't kill the sickness," he whispered. "She changed where it lived." The medical report listed his death as septicemia, though the autopsy found no infection. The hospital kept his samples locked in a vault, but the vials went missing during a renovation in 1940. Some say a janitor took them, believing the glass itself was valuable. Others claim the bottles were never real to begin with, only part of the story that seemed to grow from any hand that touched its edges. Yet in the decades since, a faint silvery stain remains on the floorboards of that old vault, and no amount of cleaning has ever removed it. By 1941, the widow's tale had crossed from memory into folklore, its facts diluted, its edges softened, yet something within it refused to die. The land where her house once stood had been quietly purchased by the county, officially designated as unused property. During those years, WPA workers were sent to clear fallen timber along the creek to open a road. The men refused to camp near the ruins, claiming their tools rusted overnight and their lanterns went dim when set near the ground. The foreman filed a single-line report to his supervisor. Area unsuitable for extended work. Soil corrosive. He never returned. That same year, a schoolteacher from Savannah, Elise Carr, decided to write a local history of Waverly Creek for her students. Her research led her to county archives, where she unearthed what appeared to be one of Dr. Greaves's field sketches, the outline of the widow's apothecary table with notations on temperature and mixture. Scrawled in the margin, barely legible, was a phrase, "Reaction sustained indefinitely." Elise became fascinated. In her notes, she theorized that the widow's final formula could have created a form of self-perpetuating chemical process, something that continued reacting within the soil. The idea was dismissed by colleagues as scientific folklore, but she pursued it anyway. She visited the site in late summer, taking with her a glass jar and a small spade. In her diary, found years later among school records, Elise described the visit with clinical precision. The air was stale and metallic, she wrote. Every breath tasted of iron. Beneath the vines I uncovered a small clearing of pale mud where nothing grew. The earth pulsed faintly, as if stirred by unseen movement. I filled one jar halfway and sealed it. The moment I lifted it, I heard a soft tapping, slow and deliberate, echoing through the soil. She left before sunset, her nerve, as frayed but her curiosity unbroken. 3 weeks later, her principal received a parcel addressed in her handwriting. Inside was the sealed jar, its contents cloudy and faintly luminous. No note accompanied it, only a single word etched into the wax, remedy. Elise Carr was never seen again. Her car was found near the highway, doors unlocked, a map folded neatly on the seat. Investigators assumed she'd fled, perhaps overwhelmed by her research. Yet her absence mirrored every disappearance before her. The jar was sent to Atlanta for testing, but the laboratory burned in an electrical fire before results were filed. The incident was ruled accidental. Among the debris, workers found shards of melted glass fused into the floor like silver veins. The county clerk closed the case under unresolved loss. In the margin of the report, someone, perhaps a typist, perhaps a later archivist, had written faintly in pencil, "The air here remembers." After 1941, little remained of Waverly Creek but silence and swamp. The county fenced off the land and stopped referring to it altogether, letting nature bury what was left. Yet the widow's legend persisted in small, inexplicable ways. Snatches of rumor that returned like fever. By 1945, when soldiers came home from war, a few locals claimed the clearing had changed. "The ground moves," one said, like something breathing under it. A lumberman who ventured too close told a reporter that his saw blade warped and bent without striking a stone. He threw it away, but the smell of metal clung to his hands for days. In 1947, an amateur historian named John Luther began compiling a series of essays titled Forgotten Cures of the South. He treated the widow's story as metaphor, calling it a cautionary tale of science unmoored from mercy. But in his private notebook, discovered after his death, he wrote something different. "I've seen the bottles. They're still there, half buried near the creek. Some hum faintly when struck by wind." Luther's wife later told interviewers that he returned from those trips sleepless, his eyes red, complaining of a ringing that grew worse near storms. That same year, a group of university students from Macon planned a field visit to document folk medical sites. Only 3 returned. They claimed one of their classmates had fallen into a sinkhole near the old cellar site, vanishing beneath a curtain of mud. Searchers found no trace, no body, no footprints, just an opening that seemed to collapse in on itself overnight. The surviving students refused to speak publicly, but one told a friend years later that the ground sounded hollow, like a drum full of air. By the close of the decade, all talk of the widow had retreated into folklore collections, those thin pamphlets filed under local curiosities. But every so often, a stranger passing through Chassin asked about her. The older residents would only shake their heads. One, a blacksmith's son who'd grown up hearing his father tell the tale, said, "It wasn't that she meant harm. She just listened too long to what she shouldn't have." As the 1950s approached, the road to Waverly Creek was reclaimed by kudzu and red mud. The creek shifted course, swallowing part of the lowland. Still, hunters spoke of a faint glow seen through the fog on certain nights, soft, amber, and steady, hovering where her kitchen once stood. The smell of camphor would drift across the water, gone before morning. Whether it was phosphorescence, swamp gas, or something older, no one dared to find out. The widow's name was spoken only when someone fell ill without reason, and even then, only as a whisper. She's still mixing. By the mid-1950s, almost every trace of Waverly Creek had been consumed by the swamp. The bridge rotted away, the road disappeared beneath vines, and even the old fence posts sank into the earth. Yet on certain summer nights, travelers along the back highways swore they could still see a faint house light far off through the trees, a dull glow the color of old brass, flickering like a lantern left in an empty room. Truck drivers claimed it moved as they drove, as though keeping pace through the woods. Local radio programs took up the story briefly, calling it Georgia's Phantom Healer. But interest faded after a few fruitless searches led to wrecked tires, broken axles, and the smell of sulfur hanging over the marsh. In 1956, a small expedition from the University of Georgia visited the site as part of a study on forgotten rural settlements. The group's leader, a historian named Alan Beach, wrote that he found nothing but a depression filled with water and reeds. It was like standing on the skin of something sleeping, he wrote. Yet he did recover one object, a small glass bottle, its stopper sealed tight, containing only a trace of colorless liquid. Beach delivered it to the university chemistry lab for examination. The bottle cracked the next morning before analysis could begin, and the liquid evaporated instantly, leaving a faint ring of residue that tarnished the metal tabletop. The lab technician described a brief flash of light and a sharp medicinal scent like a hospital burned into stone. The room was closed for cleaning, and the event quietly removed from university records. Meanwhile, stories from nearby towns kept the legend alive. Fishermen said that when storms passed over the swamp, the air would hum like a tuning fork, and ripples would form on the water in perfect circles, though no wind stirred. One farmer from the outskirts told his grandson that his plow struck a buried jar, shattering it. Inside, he found liquid still clear after decades. He buried the pieces back immediately, refusing to touch the soil again. By the end of the decade, an article in Southern Folklore Review summarized the tale as a convergence of rural superstition and unrecorded chemistry. It concluded with a simple line, "No verifiable evidence remains, yet the ground itself has memory." For the locals, that statement rang truer than any science could prove. They said that when the night turned too still, the air near the old creek took on the faint scent of the widow's medicine, sweet, metallic, and sorrowful. Some believed it was only the wind through the reeds. Others said it was the sound of her work continuing, as it had for nearly half a century, beneath the quiet Georgia soil. By 1960, Waverly Creek existed only as a name on brittle deeds and fading stories, told by those too old to remember whether they'd seen the place or only dreamed it. Yet its legend still clung to Georgia's backroads like fog. Each generation seemed to find it anew, dressing it in the language of its time. One decade's ghost, another's cautionary tale. That year, the state planned to reroute a power line through the region, and surveyors returned to the old creek bed for the first time in nearly 20 years. They expected marsh and ruin. What they found was a shallow depression of hardened clay, unnaturally smooth, with no sign of plant growth. When their equipment struck the ground, it gave a hollow sound, almost metallic. One man swore it reverberated, as though the earth beneath was empty. The foreman, uneasy, ordered soil samples taken to the state laboratory. The report was brief. High levels of iron and residual organic trace, non-hazardous but atypical. Yet the technicians made private notes of another observation. When the samples were left overnight in sealed containers, a faint mist gathered inside the glass. It condensed into droplets that carried a sharp medicinal odor. Within hours, the droplets vanished, leaving behind a faint, silvery film. The lead chemist wrote, "It behaves as if alive." The line was crossed out before the document was archived. That same summer, a small piece appeared in the Atlanta Journal titled, "The Widow's Field Still Empty." The writer, a young correspondent named Beatrice Holt, visited the area to interview residents of nearby towns. She found that few were willing to speak. One elderly woman finally told her, "The ground remembers what it's given. Some things don't stay buried because they're not finished." Holt described standing at the site during dusk, watching the shadows lengthen, when she noticed something glint near the edge of the reeds. She bent down and found a fragment of glass, the corner of a bottle stopper, smooth and curved. When she lifted it, a faint ringing filled the air, lasting only a moment, like the echo of metal struck long ago. Holt kept the fragment on her desk for several years afterward, claiming it brought her strange luck. Articles sold easily, doors opened, small illnesses passed. But she later wrote in her diary that it sometimes hummed faintly on still nights. When she moved from Georgia in 1965, she threw it into a river on her way out of town. The ripples widened, glimmered silver under the moonlight, and then vanished. Her final note on the subject read, "Some stories keep breathing because they never learned how to die." By the early 1970s, the story of the widow of Waverly Creek had aged into near myth. To most, she was a cautionary legend, a name invoked by parents to quiet restless children, or by professors lecturing on rural superstition. Yet even then, some fragments of her world refused to fade. During the summer of 1972, a small team of graduate students from Emory University conducted an oral history project on forgotten Georgia towns. Their tape transcripts, archived decades later, reveal unease in their voices. One recording captures the rustle of reeds and faint static beneath their words. The interviewer remarks, half-jokingly, that the microphone's picking up something from underground. The reply, muffled laughter, ends abruptly when a low tone hums through the recorder, steady and rhythmic. None of the group noticed it at the time. The sound was discovered only upon playback. Among their notes was a detailed sketch of the widow's supposed homestead. One student, a historian named Charles Dorn, described the site as unnaturally preserved, like a wound that never closes. He recorded traces of metallic dust clinging to roots and stones near the creek bed. Dorn later wrote an unpublished paper suggesting that the widow's experiments may have altered the mineral balance of the soil, creating a self-sustaining chemical reaction that imitates the behavior of decay. His conclusion echoed that of Dr. Elias Ransom from decades earlier, an unending reaction, still alive in its own way. He titled his draft, "The Living Remedy." 2 months after completing the study, Dorn disappeared while hiking alone along the same back roads that once led to Waverly Creek. His body was never found. Only his backpack surfaced, containing the final page of his notes. It read, "I heard glass breathe." By the late 1970s, the widow's land had been entirely reclaimed by the swamp. Locals said the water glow ed faintly in moonlight, shimmering like silver dust beneath the surface. Some nights fishermen claimed to hear a faint clinking sound, like bottles tapping together under the water's skin. Others spoke of seeing a dim lantern glow deep among the reeds, flickering and vanishing when approached. Most dismissed it as imagination, or gas rising from decay. But a few, the ones who lingered too long, insisted it wasn't light at all, but reflection. And so the story of the widow of Georgia ended much as it began, quiet, uncertain, and heavy with the scent of metal and camphor. Her name never entered any textbook, and her cures were never written into law or medicine. But in the county archives, one margin note still survives, faint and nearly erased by time. It reads simply, "The widow's work unfinished." Even now, travelers who cross that forgotten stretch of land say the air turns cold without wind, and that for a brief moment the stillness feels aware, as if the ground itself is listening, waiting for someone to ask what it remembers.